So, well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation, and it's a great honor to be here in Lancaster. So thank you, Patrick, thank you, Seo, and thank you, Duarte, for the hospitality. To talk about Camões in Lancaster is something I never thought I would do, but we're celebrating Camões' 500th anniversary in Portugal at the moment, and so it's an opportunity to go back in time in a certain way and to try and think why this author is so relevant to us in the Portuguese-speaking world and why he can be relevant when talked about outside Portugal. Because in fact he was born 500 years ago in 1524, and as has already been said, he occupies the place in Portuguese arts and letters which Shakespeare occupies in the Anglophone world, or Dante in Italy. He really is Portugal's most famous writer, and every Portuguese schoolgirl and schoolboy is required to read parts of his epic poem, the Lusíads, Os Lusíadas, as well as a selection of his lyric poems. So, as to be expected from a poet who wrote in the 16th century, Camões is difficult for modern readers. So getting to grips with the vocabulary and the grammar is one of the first challenges which Camões' 21st century readers have to come to terms with. But there are other challenges too, other than the difficult language. Camões lived and wrote in a historical context that is very different from ours. His worldview is obviously that of a 16th century intellectual who had grown up in a country dominated by the Catholic Church and from which the Muslim population had been practically wiped out a few centuries before, and the Jewish population, or the majority of the Jewish population, had been expelled a generation earlier. So the Inquisition itself was established in Portugal when Camões was a teenager, and the Portuguese Inquisition is said to have burned more people at the stake than even the Spanish Inquisition. And George Buchanan, whom you mentioned earlier, was arrested by the Inquisition after his brief period as professor in Coimbra, and was lucky to have survived being in prison, and he must have been very relieved when he came back to the British Isles after, I think, 2 years in prison, first in Coimbra and then in Lisbon. So Camões was already 48 when his first and only book was published, the Lusíads, Os Lusíadas, in 1572, and to have the book printed, he had to request a formal permit from the Inquisition. It's not surprising, therefore, that the said book displays religious attitudes that we today find outdated and intolerant. So Camões assumes that his readers are completely on board with the idea that Roman Catholicism is the only true religion. His story in that book, the first sea voyage from Europe to India, gives him plenty of scope for his Portuguese characters to encounter Muslims and Hindus. But the narrator's underlying assumption when describing these encounters is that religions other than Roman Catholicism are simply wrong. We can regret that this doesn't fit in with our more enlightened modern outlook. All religions should be equally respected, but it would also be wrong, I think, to hold Camões up to our contemporary standards and then find that he doesn't live up to them. One aspect, though, where he does deserve credit is that he allows for more than one viewpoint in his poem. He presents the reader with a Portuguese outlook when his navigators encounter Africans and Indians, but he also devises scenes in the poem where Africans and Indians express their unflattering views of the Portuguese. So the Lusíads has a lot to offer the modern reader. It makes us think about the beginnings of European imperialism in the 16th century by presenting us with a story in which several characters voice their misgivings about the moral validity of Portuguese overseas expansionism. So there's a jingoistic side to the Lusiads that's undeniable, but there's also a very critical side, and that, I think, is the surprising part. Well, I'll come back to these ideas because I've been jumping ahead a bit. The man whose 500th anniversary we're celebrating this year had a very interesting life, and he wrote wonderful lyric poem other than his grand epic, The Lusiads. And one of his most interesting poems, personal poems, is a love poem for a black enslaved woman. So this is probably the first poem by a mainstream European author which focuses on love for a non-European woman. So I'll talk for a little while about his life before coming back to the Lusiads. So when we think of the big names in 16th century European arts and letters, and we were talking about this at lunch just now, we're mainly dealing with men who never left Europe. Michelangelo never traveled outside Italy, and Shakespeare, I take it, never left Britain. Leonardo da Vinci was considered well-traveled because he had been to France. As the subject of a Portuguese king who had a far-flung empire in Africa and India and beyond, Camões was able to broaden his horizons in a way that would have been unthinkable for Michelangelo, Leonardo, or Shakespeare. But it must also be said that Camões did not travel south of the equator and up the east coast of Africa and to India and the Far East because he wanted to broaden his horizons. He was someone who made rather a mess of his life, and it was circumstances rather than choice that got him packed off to India. Well, we'll come to that in a moment, but first let's look back 500 years to 1524, the year in which Camões allegedly was born. I say allegedly because it's one of the curious facts in literary history that we know the exact day, month, and year in which the Roman poets Virgil and Horace were born more than 1,600 years before Camões' birth, but we don't know for sure when Camões was born. We know that he died on the 10th of June, 1580, because the official document confirming the payment of his pension to his mother, who outlived him, is still extant. And there it said in black and white that he died on the 10th of June, 1580. And some of you will know that the 10th of June is Portugal's national holiday. He is thought to have been born in 1524 because a 17th century commentator on his work claimed to have seen documental evidence for this, but the documents he alleges to have seen have never been found. It's worth remembering that Lisbon suffered a massive earthquake in the 18th century in 1755, in which most of the city was destroyed by the earthquake itself and by the ensuing tsunami. Many official archives were lost forever, so we're confronted with the fact that we don't know exactly when, or indeed where, the most famous writer in Portuguese history was born. We also have no incontrovertible evidence as to where and how he acquired his amazing classical education. And here I recall the famous tag, little Latin and less Greek. In Camões' case, I'd venture lots of Latin and no Greek. The most likely possibility is that he studied at Coimbra, Portugal's oldest university, as Cel mentioned, although there's no record of his matriculation at the university. However, that does not disprove the possibility that he studied at the University of Coimbra, because it's known and accepted that records were kept in a haphazard way, and there are other examples of people who certainly studied at Coimbra because their studies were witnessed by contemporaries, but of whom there is no official record. So it's relatively safe, in my view, to assume that Camões studied at Coimbra. The Camões family had been linked to Coimbra, at least since the time of the poet's great-grandfather, and the poet's father had a first cousin, whose name was also Camões, who was chancellor of the university, as well as head of the monastery of Santa Cruz in Coimbra. This was a renowned center for classical learning. Besides, 3 lyric poems by Camões were ostensibly written in Coimbra because he claims to be looking at the river Mondego, the river that flows through Coimbra. In any case, his 17th century biographers had no doubts that he studied at Coimbra, and they also agree that the next period of his life was spent in Lisbon, where he seems to have gained admittance in court circles. He probably found patrons among rich aristocrats, and this is borne out by poems of his dedicated to upper-class men such as dukes and counts and their relatives. Camões apparently had no income of his own, so as was customary for artists and writers in the 16th century, he depended on patronage. But he got into trouble in these upper-class circles. One view is that he was romantically interested in a woman who was out of his league socially. Another view is that jealous rival poets intrigued against him. His own violent personality was far from blameless, as we'll see shortly. So whatever the truth may have been, he left Lisbon, or was made to leave Lisbon, in the mid to late 1540s to serve as a soldier in North Africa, in the Portuguese outpost of Ceuta, which now belongs to Spain. Now, Ceuta had, throughout its history, belonged to Carthaginians, Romans, and Vandals, who, despite their name, were Christians. It was conquered by Arabs in the 8th century and remained a predominantly Muslim town until 1415, when it was attacked and conquered by the Portuguese king João I, whose English wife, as Patrick said, was Philippa of Lancaster. The conquest of Ceuta marks the beginning of Portuguese expansionism. Portugal was and still is a country where natural resources in terms of gold, silver, and other metals had already been mined dry by the Romans many centuries before. So the Portuguese crown pinned its hopes on gaining access to African markets for gold and enslaved people. In fact, the Portuguese so-called discoveries along the coast of West Africa were really the attempt to discover new markets for buying and selling on enslaved people. Philip of Lancaster's son, the famous Prince Henry the Navigator, whom we saw just now, was effectively the driving force behind Portugal's involvement with slavery, which lasted well into the 19th century, although slavery was abolished in Portugal itself in 1761, but obviously not in Brazil, then a Portuguese colony. Brazil abolished slavery in 1888. Now, Portugal was to colonize huge chunks of West Africa, notably Angola, as well as Guinea and the islands of Cape Verde and São Tomé, and also of East Africa, Mozambique. But Portugal's crusade-like obsession with North Africa never turned out to Portugal's advantage. Portuguese Ceuta, where Camões went to serve as a soldier, was constantly under attack by Muslim forces in North Africa. And towards the end of Camões' life, the then Portuguese king, crusade-obsessed, led his Christian army against a much larger Muslim army in Morocco. He lost the battle and thereby not only wiped out the Portuguese armed forces entirely, but also wiped out Portuguese independence, since the king himself was unmarried and childless. So the next king of Portugal was the king of Spain, Philip II of Spanish Armada fame. Camões' military stint in North Africa was similarly not strong on heroics, but marked him for life and literally. He got hit in the eye by a stray pellet of gun or cannon shot and completely lost his sight in his right eye. For someone whose life and livelihood depending on reading and writing, the loss of one eye must have made everything that much harder. Back in Lisbon, he appeared determined to make things even worse for himself than they might otherwise have been. His violent personality really came to the fore when in June 1552 he was arrested in Lisbon for his part in a brawl involving 3 other men. We know of this incident thanks to a document which is still extant, a royal pardon signed in March 1553, in which the king, Juan III, allows Camoens's release from prison. This year, the king writes, he will serve me in India. In the event, Camoens was to stay in India for much longer than is implied by this year. Camoens sailed to India in March 1553 for another stint of military service and arrived at Goa in September of the same year. The ship on which he sailed made it to India, but it was shipwrecked on the return voyage. So Camoens was lucky that he was forced to stay in India and couldn't return at once, as he perhaps would have liked. For the little he let slip about Portuguese India in one of his letters is far from positive. The 17 years he spent in Asia were probably not very happy, even after his discharge from the army, which happened 2 or 3 years after his arrival. One thing I always ask myself is how fit for military service could this man have been who was completely blind in one eye? Be that as it may, he stayed on in India and traveled to Macau in China, where he's said to have taken up the job of trustee for the property of the deceased. Nobody is entirely sure what that means. He probably went as far as the Moluccan Islands. Some scholars think that a poem of his was written there. On his return to India, he famously survived shipwreck near Cambodia. On this occasion, he is said to have salvaged the manuscript of the Lusiads by holding it aloft with one arm as he swam ashore. So the one-eyed poet was also able to swim with one arm. Well, we wouldn't be unjustified in feeling skeptical about this miraculous survival of the manuscript, because scholars in the 17th century had already noticed that this feat of swimming while clutching one's writings matched a very similar situation in the life of Julius Caesar. We should be prepared to admit the possibility that certain incidents in the early biographies of Camoens are an imaginative embroidering of things that had happened to other famous authors. Camoens himself set the example in his lyric poetry. He's keen to present himself as someone to whom the same things happened, curiously enough, which had already happened to big names in literature, such as the Italian poet Petrarch and the much earlier Roman poet Ovid. So after 15 years in India and in other places, from the Horn of East Africa to the Far East, Camoens must have felt that it was time to return to Portugal. And the main reason for this is that in all likelihood, he had finished his epic poem about Vasco da Gama's first voyage to India and was keen to get the book published in Lisbon. It had taken him 6 months to travel from Lisbon to Goa, but it took him 2 years to travel from Goa to Lisbon. On the one hand, he ran out of funds. On the other hand, previous debts caught up with him, and he was left stranded by the captain of the ship on Mozambique Island, where he remained in complete destitution for a couple of years until a group of aristocratic friends he'd made in Goa pulled together the necessary money to pay for his trip home. So as from 1570, Camoens was back in Lisbon, and now his priority was the problem of finding a patron to pay for the publication of his epic poem. That the poem was published in 1572 shows that he did indeed find someone to fund the enterprise, but funnily enough, the name of the patron is not mentioned in the book itself. Scholars have surmised that the patron or patrons wished to remain anonymous. The first edition of the Lusiads has no dedication and no dedicatee. There is no potted biography of the author and obviously no blurb. All we get by way of preface or introduction is the permit for the book to be published, signed by the Inquisition, specifically by Friar Bartolomeu Ferreira. Now, readers of the Lusiads have often asked themselves whether this inquisitor actually read the whole book, because towards the end of the poem there are several bits bordering on the pornographic. This is a question I'll return to shortly, but first I'd like to give you just a general idea of the Lusiads and of some of the issues it raises. So the Lusiads is divided into what in ancient Roman terms would have constituted 10 books, although Camões follows the Italian fashion of the day in using the term canto, like Dante had done in Divine Comedy and Ariosto in the Orlando Furioso. The Lusiads comprises 10 cantos, written not in Dante's terza rima, groups of 3 verses, but in Ariosto's ottava rima, that is stanzas of 8 verses. Camões packs an enormous amount of material into these 10 cantos, so much so that readers sometimes come away with the sensation that the main theme itself, the first sea voyage from Europe to India, often disappears from view under a mass of other themes which, to Camões, clearly were just as interesting. Not that the story of sailing to India for the first time could have been without interest to a poet who had actually undertaken the voyage himself. For the Roman poet Virgil had written of Aeneas's journey from Troy to Italy, with a stop in North Africa, but his descriptions rely on books, not on personal experience. Camões, as we have already seen, sailed for India in 1553 and knew what it felt like to be on a ship in the open Atlantic Ocean. The ship he sailed on undoubtedly followed the same route as Vasco da Gama had done, sailing southwest after the Cape Verde archipelago to catch the trade winds that enabled ships to round the Cape of Good Hope without getting shipwrecked along the coast of Western Africa. The poem begins with a grand and beautifully ornate series of stanzas, complete with a council of pagan gods, where it is clear at once that Camões follows the classical principle in medias res, as Horace had said, and starts his narrative at a point in the story where the Portuguese fleet has already completed half the journey to India. When the story begins, the ships are on the Indian Ocean, sailing off the coast of East Africa near Mozambique. In Cantos 1 and 2, the arrival of the Portuguese provokes unfriendly reactions on Mozambique Island, in Quiloa on the coast of modern Tanzania, and in Mombasa. The fleet only escapes being ambushed and destroyed because the goddess Venus comes to the rescue. So here we need to stop and ask, why did Camões opt to tell a Christian story in which the strings are pulled by pagan gods? Why does the action of the poem depend on Jupiter, Venus, and Bacchus, and not on Christ or the Virgin Mary? Ever since the book's release in 1572, readers and scholars have grappled with this issue. The inquisitor who signed the authorization allowing the poem to be published clearly felt the need to explain away the mythological content. He writes that it seemed necessary to me, here I quote, to warn readers that to magnify the nautical difficulties which the Portuguese faced in order to reach India, the author makes use of a figment, the gods of the pagans. But since this is poetic fiction, the poet did not intend otherwise other than to adorn his poetic style. And thus we did not find it improper, says the inquisitor, that these fables concerning the gods remain in the work. It must also be stressed, however, he says, that according to the truth of our holy faith, the gods of the pagans are devils. So, unquote. In the 17th century, the first large-scale commentary on the Lusiads proposed that the pagan gods are to be interpreted allegorically. That this approach was not without its problems is immediately obvious from that author's main contention. Venus, the Roman goddess of sex, is to be interpreted as an allegory of the Roman Catholic Church. So the question why Venus is the one that allows the most straightforward answer. So Camões' Venus is Virgil's Venus, reprising in the Lusiads her role in the Aeneid. In Virgil's poem, Venus is partial to the Trojans because Aeneas himself is her son. In the Lusiads, in the absence of a mythological link between Venus and Lusitania, She is said to, quote, love the Lusitanian people because in them she saw the qualities of her beloved Romans, their strong hearts, their lucky star in North Africa, which is embroidering the truth, their language, which she almost believes to be Latin, unquote. So it's thanks to Venus, in any case, that the Portuguese arrived safely at Malindi in northern Kenya, where at last they receive a friendly welcome from the Muslim leader, as Dr. Duarte Alves just said. So the King of Malindi is invited on board Gama's ship and is lavishly entertained by the Portuguese captain. So Camões opts to follow Virgil's example by setting up a narrative situation in which the King of Malindi asks Gama, like Dido had asked Aeneas in the Aeneid, to fill him in on the story so far. Aeneas had responded to Dido by describing how he escaped the sack of Troy and telling the story of all his subsequent wanderings in the Mediterranean. Gama is less self-referential than Aeneas and opts to go back further in time, so his narrative is largely a history of Portugal since its foundation in the 12th century. As for the historical facts of Gama's voyage, Camões skips and cherry-picks at will. Significantly, the most arresting episode of Gama's narrative in the Lusíads is not historical at all. The crowning event in his story, near the end of Canto 5, is the encounter with Edemastor, a gigantic talking rock which probably represents South Africa's Table Mountain. When Gama finishes telling his story at the end of Canto 5, we're exactly halfway through the Lusíads, but the events we have witnessed in real time represent only a few stages of the journey along the coast of East Africa between Mozambique and Kenya. The King of Malindi gives the Portuguese a friendly send-off and lends them a local African pilot, thanks to whose ability they will finally be able to reach India. In India, local soothsayers presciently warn their ruler that no good will come of the Portuguese in India. Their arrival spells, quote, an eternal captivity and destruction, unquote, for the Indian population. Early in the poem, it had already been said in Africa that the Portuguese would subject the African population to, quote, enslavement and death. That Camões allows these voices to be heard in his poem is greatly to his credit, since it shows that he was able to see Portuguese imperialism from the viewpoint of the colonized and the enslaved. The very last canto of the poem celebrates the mystical marriage between Vasco da Gama and the sea goddess Tethys, an allusion perhaps to the annual Venetian ceremony in which the Doge married the sea. At the wedding breakfast, a nymph bursts into song and tells of many Portuguese military exploits destined to happen in India. These are, of course, seen from a European perspective, and they give a very one-sided view of Indian history. As military exploits seen as heroic from a Portuguese standpoint can equally be seen as war crimes from the opposite perspective. Camões must have been aware of this, given that in the poem he has not silenced the African and Indian viewpoints. It seems significant that after naming the Portuguese viceroys of India, each more violent than the last, Camões decided to round off the whole theme of Christians in India with a story of the non-violent apostle Thomas, doubting Thomas from the Gospel of John, who took Christianity to India in a truly Christian, non-violent way, preferring to be killed rather than to kill. Now, I began by saying that Camões occupies in Portuguese arts and letters the place of Shakespeare in the Anglophone world, but as a literary object, the Lusíads is completely unlike Shakespeare. The work with which we can justifiably compare Camões' epic is his model, Virgil's Aeneid. Like the Aeneid, the Lusíads ended up becoming a school text, in both cases thanks to the rather trite way in which both poems lend themselves to be read as propaganda. When encountered for the first time, Camões's text certainly takes on the appearance of a work designed to glorify the march of Portuguese history in the same way that the Aeneid glorifies the concept of Roman world destiny. In the last half-century, however, scholars have become increasingly attuned to other facets of the Lusiads, and it's fair to say that contemporary views of the poem tend to distance themselves from the traditional patriotic reading by focusing on the aspects in the Lusiads that present Portuguese overseas expansion in a critical light. The patriotic reading was, of course, the standard approach right from the beginning of the book's reception. As I mentioned, 8 years after the book was first published, Portugal lost its independence to Spain. During the 60 years in which the Portuguese throne was occupied by Spanish kings, there had to be something political about reading the Lusiads. And when in the 19th century the rise of the British Empire caused Portugal to lose its standing on the world stage, as it were, Portuguese readers could find in the Lusiads a means of recovering some form of collective self-esteem. Inevitably, the poem came to be read in schools and universities as a justification for Portuguese imperialism during the fascist regime of the dictator António Salazar, which lasted from 1926 to 1974, Salazar himself having died in 1970. Since the 1960s, the Aeneid has more than once elicited the view that Virgil wrote his poem in such a way that readers should be able to discern more than one voice. Scholars have tried to work out how Virgil's unmistakable public voice, his official Roman voice, as it were, contrasts with a more personal private voice, which is allowed to express sadness about the human cost of Roman imperialism. Sadness about the cost of Portuguese imperialism is there for all to hear in the Lusiads. I think it's fair to say that Camões went out of his way to make room for voices that react critically to the poem's stated purpose of glorifying Portugal's overseas expansion. That said, we can't simply look away when excuses are made for Portuguese violence in Africa and in India, the excuse being that imposing Roman Catholicism on the world is the higher good, where any means are acceptable to bring this end about. But it has taken us, the Portuguese reading public, 500 years to come to terms with all the implications of empire and colonialism. So perhaps we can forgive Camões on his 500th birthday for not having beaten us to the post. He had a difficult life and he wrote a difficult book. Had he written a simplistic book, we wouldn't still be needing to engage with it 5 centuries later. So, thank you.